Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 4 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're talking about all things related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season, and giving you guys some perspective as to who has the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous matchups going into this upcoming week, and how that is going to potentially affect their overall upside. After we talk about matchups, introducing those statistics and the variables that I've found throughout doing my research, I'll of course talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings for Week 4 of the 2021 fantasy football season. My rankings will be in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard or a full PPR. But if you're trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings and of course get answers to your questions, you can either check out the Patreon down in the description of the video or come by Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be doing Kickoff with Kirchhoff like I do every Sunday morning, the live stream, making sure that your lineups are ready to go for this week's contest in order to help you win. Now, besides helping you win this week, the entire objective of this channel is to help you win a 2021 fantasy football championship. So if you have not yet already, make sure you subscribe. Of course, we're making content every single day, whether it is wide receiver, running back, quarterback, tight end rankings, our live streams, our must drafts, our trade targets, our rest of season strength of schedule, our waiver wire videos, all the content in the world in terms of fantasy football to help you gain an advantage on your league and in order to help you win a championship this upcoming season. Thank you very much for those of you who have already done so and have continued to support with your viewership and or by smashing the like button and commenting down below. I really do appreciate it. All right, so let's begin by talking about matchups. But before we do have timestamps down in the description of the video for those of you who are interested in finding a specific player and hearing my thoughts in regards to how I think they're going to perform this upcoming week. So for those of you who are interested, you can go ahead and check that out down in the description. All right, let's talk about some matchups. Again, like we've talked about it, I went ahead and I've calculated how many points respective defenses have allowed to opposing wide receivers thus far this season, and the statistics to the left of me pretty much show that. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers, 145.8 in the first 3 games of the season. That is an insane number. And of course, falling with the Washington football team, Tennessee Titans, Minnesota Vikings, Indianapolis Colts, Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, it's quite surprising because in comparison to last year, the Washington football team, the Indianapolis Colts, Pittsburgh Steelers, these were good secondaries. These were, teams that in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers were really actually good. Now, obviously, with rookies coming in, with players leaving with free agency, with injuries happening, it's taken quite a turn here. And obviously, these are the defenses that we want to go ahead and expose in the coming weeks. But regardless, wanted to go ahead and present this to you guys. On the back end of the spectrum, in terms of teams that aren't really allowing many points to opposing wide receivers, often has to do with the fact that they've either played teams that haven't utilized their respective wide receivers. Like, let's say, for example, the Philadelphia Eagles. Though they are on the bottom of this list, Week 1 against the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons were not prepared for that game and pretty much were completely shut out. They only scored 2 field goals in that contest. In Week 2, they played against the 49ers. The 49ers, again, without Brandin Ayuk getting much work, Deebo Samuel was the only guy catching the ball in Week 2. In Week 3, the Philadelphia Eagles, all the Dallas Cowboys on Monday night had to do was run the ball. So again, giving you some perspective as to there are some of these defenses that can be taken advantage of, but they haven't yet already because we're still early in the season. As we continue on, as we get to about 6 to 8 weeks, we'll have a full representation as to what the matchups look like on a weekly basis and what defenses certainly should be taken advantage of. Now, I wanted to go ahead and kind of expand this matchup portion of the video and give you guys exact statistics as to how many receptions, targets, yards, touchdowns, wide receivers have had against these respective defenses. Now, of course, a lot of teams throw the ball against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, typically because either the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are heavily leading, and in order to come back, you have to pass the ball against that defense because you're definitely not going to be able to run it. Also, in conjunction with the Washington football team, in the matchups that they've played, Justin Herbert in Week 1 had to heavily throw the ball. Week 2, Daniel Jones was slinging it. In Week 3, Josh Allen did not take the pedal off the metal and continue to throw in the direction of that secondary and absolutely punish them. Either way, giving you guys more of a breakdown as to, of course, how many stats, how many touchdowns, how many receiving yards respective defenses have allowed to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Hopefully you guys appreciate it. If you do, smash that like button down below and let me know down in the comment section if y'all would like to see more content in regards to this and more breakdowns for matchups. All right, thank you very much. let's get into it, shall we? Now that we've talked about matchups, we'll refer back to those statistics throughout the remainder of this video, but do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We are going to mention 36 wide receivers here, but we are not in a capacity to know by Wednesday, because considering this is when the video is being recorded, on Wednesday that, certain players are going to be in or out. We don't know about A.J. Brown. We don't know about Diontae Johnson, but we can make educated guesses based on their injuries and what we've been given in terms of information from their respective teams. Obviously, everything is going to change, but again, if you're trying to stay up to date, Patreon down below in the description and or Sunday morning. I'll see you then. All right, let's begin and start talking about my week 4 wide receiver rankings, beginning with our wide receiver ones. And specifically, the number 1 overall wide receiver for a 3rd consecutive week, it is going to continue to be Davante Adams. Shouldn't come to any surprise considering how effective he has been already this season. In terms of overall targets, he leads the entire National Football League at the wide receiver position with a total of 34 targets in comparison to a lot of these other guys who have had, 3 consecutive good weeks. Let's not forget, in week 1 against the New Orleans Saints, he really didn't have much production in comparison to what he has done in the last 2 weeks specifically. Like this past week against the 49ers, 18 targets leading to 12 receptions, 132 receiving yards, and a touchdown for 25.2 half PPR fantasy points. And on top of it, I was pretty sure that he got knocked out and concussed on one of those plays, yet he still came out, balled out, and helped his team catch a victory. This upcoming week, they play against a very easy matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have given up the 6th most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Just this past week, the Pittsburgh Steelers got torn apart by Jamar Chase and Tyler Boyd. T. Higgins wasn't even on the field in that contest yet. Those 2 wide receivers combined for 8 receptions, 111 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. The week prior to that, the Las Vegas Raiders and Henry Ruggs, another one of these young wide receivers, torched that secondary for 5 catches, 113 yards, and a touchdown. We know that the Pittsburgh Steelers are struggling defensively, whether it is by injury and or the fact that their offense hasn't been able to produce and their defense can't get off the field. Either way, the Green Bay Packers should be finding a lot of success, especially with Davante Adams. Cooper Kupp is our number 2 wide receiver, but the thing about Cooper Kupp is that as it currently stands, he's the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy in a half PPR scoring format, averaging 26.2 fantasy points per game. If I was going to tell you prior to the season starting that there was a possibility that Cooper Kupp was going to accomplish this, nobody would believe me because, to be honest, the numbers that he is seeing at this current moment in time, a 35.1% target share. That is an unbelievable number, and yes, it most likely isn't going to sustain for the entirety of this season, but so long as it's pretty much lasted, he's gotten himself 5 receiving touchdowns, is 2nd in the National Football League, tied for total overall targets. His red zone target share is about 44% of the Los Angeles Rams. He is just an unstoppable force. Coming off of a week in which he had 9 catches, 96 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 26.1 fantasy points. What more can we ask of Cooper Kupp on a weekly basis? He already has more touchdowns this season than he had all of last year. So it kind of puts into perspective just how much of an improvement he has shown. This upcoming week, they take on the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 10th most points to opposing wide receivers. Just in the last couple weeks, the Minnesota Vikings wide receivers absolutely dominated that secondary. 17 catches, 195 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns between Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne, and Justin Jefferson, all of them dominating. As of this current moment in time, this Arizona Cardinals defense has given up 5 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers this season, which is tied for 5th amongst all defenses. It's a very advantageous matchup, a division rival, but Cooper Kupp should be able to feast. Tyreek Hill is our number 3 overall wide receiver. Again, Tyreek Hill in the last 2 weeks has kind of disappeared, and I understand that you may be frustrated, but if in fact you are not a Tyreek Hill manager at this current moment in time, I would say that you should look out and potentially try to purchase him and buy him low. In the last 2 weeks, he's only scored 11.6 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, and they've lost 2 games in a row. Is that a coincidence? I think not. I think the implementation and the continuous usage in terms of getting targets in the direction of Tyreek Hill obviously leads to the success of the Kansas City Chiefs as a whole. Their offense obviously is predicated on getting the ball to their best players, whether it is Travis Kelce and or Tyreek Hill, but they haven't been able to do that. This last week, 5 catches, 56 yards for 7.2 fantasy points. Not enough usage for a valuable wide receiver like Tyreek Hill, who has the ability to change the game within one play. There's a reason why last season he scored 17 touchdowns. I expect him to get back on track very soon, specifically against this Philadelphia defense, though they haven't given up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers. Patrick Mahomes is very upset. They've lost 2 in a row, and I never would have thought that I would ever see a Patrick Mahomes-led offense have a negative record. 1-2 is crazy. Either way, Tyreek Hill is going to help them kind of right the ship in the correct direction. Tyreek Hill will get back on track himself. It's going to be a great week. DK Metcalf is our number 4 overall wide receiver prospect for this upcoming week. I mean, DK Metcalf is coming off a great week. As we anticipated, the breakout was coming because you can only hold down these incredible players for so long until they go ahead and just have an explosive game. 6 catches, 107 yards, a receiving touchdown, 19.7 fantasy points. Now, the reason why I have DK Metcalf in this upper echelon category is mainly because we're unaware of what the potential in terms of the injuries of Chris Carson and or Tyler Lockett are. Both those players sustained injuries. Tyler Lockett was down for quite some time. Of course, a lot of his teammates were surrounding him because he's a huge part of that offense. And of course, in that locker room, we don't know what his status is this week. I know Chris Carson came back into the game, but again, was very limited, only played 23 snaps. So if in fact this offense is going to be quote unquote, for a lack of a better term, hamstrung, I think there's a good chance in which DK Metcalf is going to be the lead guy. And the last time I saw him lead against the San Francisco 49ers secondary was early last season. 12 catches, 161 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, had a monster game. It wouldn't surprise me if, in fact, he dominated that defense because, again, the guy that we just talked about a couple minutes ago, Davante Adams, just had himself a giant game. 12 catches, 132 and a touchdown against them this past Sunday Night Football. Either way, I think DK, regardless of what surrounds him in terms of the other threats, is going to have a lot of upside this upcoming week with the secondary of the 49ers in shambles. Of course, whether it is Emmanuel Mosley as their number 1, he hasn't really had too many reps this season. Josh Norman's already injured. Verrett got injured in week 1. They're definitely in a rotational situation, and they're definitely not finding a lot of success with the guys that they've currently had back there. Mike Williams is our number 5. It's just a matter of respect and understanding that, my goodness, he has been unbelievable. Mike Williams is, you have to start him. So regardless of where I put him in these rankings, he's going to be in your lineup. But based on what he has done thus far this season, he's the number 2 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. He has scored, 4 touchdowns already this season. I mean, wow. We thought, okay, week 1 and 2, putting up like 19, 20 points. Okay, eventually he's going to fall off and Mike Williams will come back down to earth. And we thought of all the matchups that it could potentially happen in, probably is going to be the Chiefs because the Chiefs have a decent secondary. But instead of slowing down in week 3, he actually sped up, went for 7 catches, 122, 2 touchdowns, 29.7 points, led the wide receiver position with the most points this last week. And to be honest, the Las Vegas Raiders matchup, it's exciting to me. I mean, both these teams look like they're on fire, and both these teams should be in a pretty good shootout, in my opinion. And if, in fact, Justin Herbert's coming back to the table with his arm ready to go and obviously targeting Mike Williams, over 10 times per game this season? I mean, those numbers were specifically reserved for Keenan Allen. But as of this current moment in time, Mike Williams is certainly benefiting from that as we progress. He's a great play this week as our number 5. Number 6 is Justin Jefferson playing against the Cleveland Browns. I think the Cleveland Browns matchup, though they have only given up the 5th fewest points to opposing wide receivers this season, Justin Jefferson is an animal. And from what we saw in week 1, it was a little bit of a slow, burn in terms of what we were going to find in terms of his potential. But in the last 2 weeks, he has really come on as that top 5 wide receiver that we kind of expected him to be. Obviously, coming off a week this last week in which he had 9 total receptions for 118 receiving yards, a touchdown, and himself 22.3 fantasy points. The Cleveland Browns, yes, their defense has looked a lot better than in seasons past, but they've also played against underhanded offenses. I mean, let's talk about what the Chicago Bears had this last week. How about the Houston Texans the week prior? These are not the greatest offenses, and as it currently stands, in my opinion, they've only played against one good offense. And the last time they did, Tyreek Hill went for 197 yards on 11 catches and a touchdown. And even then, when they played against Houston, when Tyrod Taylor was pretty much played for 1 quarter, Brandin Cooks still went for 9 catches, 78 and a touchdown. I absolutely believe number 1 wide receivers against this defense succeed, and I think Justin Jefferson's in for another good week. We have Stefon Diggs. Now, speaking of a wide receiver that is the number 1 of his respective team, but hasn't found his footing just yet, and hopefully, if in fact you can buy low on Stefon Diggs, you should absolutely go ahead and do so. He's coming off of another underwhelming week, to say the very least. 6 catches for 62 yards, 9.2 half PPR fantasy points. As it currently stands, they play against Houston. And if it ends up being a blowout and Stefon Diggs isn't able to get himself the ample amount of yardage, the touchdown, the receptions, obviously the opportunity is going to be there. There's a reason why he has averaged over 10 targets per game for as long as he has been with the Buffalo Bills organization. I think the Houston Texans matchup is absolutely advantageous. Of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen Marvin Jones Jr., 5 catches, 77 and a touchdown. Chark in that same game, 3 catches, 86 and a touchdown. DJ Moore this last week against that secondary, 8 catches for 126 yards. In my opinion, there's a lot of upside this upcoming week for the Bills offense, and hopefully Stefon Diggs can get back on track. We move on to DJ Moore. Speaking of DJ Moore going for 8 catches on 12 targets for 126 yards against that Houston Texans secondary, he has become an even bigger part of this offense. And it kind of has progressed week over week for him, which is fantastic. We love to see more and more growth. And now that Christian McCaffrey is unfortunately out, there may be even more opportunity going in the direction of a DJ Moore-esque wide receiver, specifically because when we talk about what Christian McCaffrey contributes in the passing in weeks 1 and 2, had himself 15 total targets. Now, of course, DJ Moore's targets have gone from 8 to 11 to 12 this last week, and of course had some incredible numbers. I think this upcoming week, the Dallas Cowboys matchup may be a tougher one in comparison to the other teams that they've played this season in terms of their secondaries, whether it be the Jets, the Houston Texans, and even the New Orleans Saints. But with that being said, the Dallas Cowboys have given up the 7th most points to opposing wide receivers, whether it was AB going for 121 and a touchdown, Godwin going for 105 and a touchdown, Keenan Allen for 100 receiving yards, Mike Williams for 7 catches, 79 and a touchdown. Even this last week, regardless of what happened, there was a lot of garbage time eventually, in which led to, of course, some success for wide receivers on the Philadelphia Eagles. It's only a matter of time that DJ Moore continues to kind of show up in this top 12 category as we progress. He's been balling out, and hopefully will continue to do so. We have Keenan Allen as our number 9. Speaking of Keenan Allen, going for 105 yards against Dallas. That was in week 2, but in week 3, found himself with another good game script. 12 targets for 8 catches, 50 receiving yards, and a touchdown. 15 total fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. As it currently stands, Keenan Allen is tied for second in total targets in the National Football League, 33. Now that is a ridiculous number considering Mike Williams has had 31 total targets on his own respective team. Now you may have thought, okay, with all the production that Mike Williams has seen, maybe Keenan Allen has kind of disappeared. That's absolutely not been the case. He has had back-to-back weeks of great performances, and to be honest, I don't think he's slowing down anytime soon because the Chargers offense is continuing to, on a weekly basis, find themselves more and more comfortable in the Joe Lombardi-led offense, and Justin Herbert is finding himself in an easier position because he has so many active weapons around him that are just finding success and finding themselves open. Keenan Allen is obviously going to be one of the safety blankets in relation to Justin Herbert, obviously with the relationship they built last season and the success in which they did so. I think this upcoming week, playing against the Raiders, an offense that they themselves haven't been able to be stopped. There's a reason why Derek Carr has thrown for 380 yards and 2 touchdowns for 3 consecutive games. I think this is going to be a very exciting matchup between these two teams. Hopefully it is a shootout. That's what I expect for the divisional matchup, and I expect Keenan Allen to continue to ball out. Moving on to our number 10, we have Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals playing on Thursday Night Football. Now, the reason why I have Ja'Marr Chase in the top 10 is because he obviously, he deserves it. This is a wide receiver that needs to be started from henceforth, regardless of what, matchup is, potentially in their direction. First and foremost, they get to play on a short week Thursday night against the Jacksonville Jaguars. We have already been given confirmation that T. Higgins, the opposite side wide receiver, and a great wide receiver at that, considering he has scored a touchdown in each of the first 2 weeks, T. Higgins is going to be out. So what does that potentially produce? More opportunity for Ja'Marr Chase. But Ja'Marr Chase and his numbers of opportunity have been far less than all of the other receivers that I've already mentioned today. A lot of the time when I look at Ja'Marr Chase, and the reason why I've had him ranked lower is because, again, you can't come off a week of 2 catches, 4 targets, and expect to once again on the following week score touchdowns with such low opportunity. But that's what he did anyway. Against Pittsburgh, 4 catches, 5 targets, 65 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns for 20.5 fantasy points. That's unbelievable. I mean, the record that he broke this last weekend was he was the youngest player in NFL history at the age of 21 to catch 4 receiving touchdowns in the first 3 games of his respective team's season. And to be honest, when we look at the Jacksonville matchup, giving up the 12th most points to opposing wide receivers, Christian Kirk last week and AJ Green both went for over 100 receiving yards and over 5 catches. Brandin Cooks, over 132 receiving yards. Courtland Sutton, 159 receiving yards. Even Tim Patrick in that game, 37 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. The Jacksonville Jaguars, they have been in trouble. And to be honest, them trading away Trey Herndon one of their starting cornerbacks to the Carolina Panthers in exchange for obviously compensation and Dan Arnold. Doesn't really help out their secondary much. And in my opinion, continues to open up possibilities for Jamar Chase to dominate. We have Calvin Ridley as our number 11. I know Calvin Ridley is another one of these wide receivers that if in fact you can buy low on. Tyreek Hill, Stefon Diggs, Calvin Ridley. Guys that are certainly every single week going to be in this top 12 category, or at least consistent enough to where they finish in the top 12 by the end of the season. I know the offense has not looked great, but certainly the opportunity is there, and it's eventually going to lead to success. And I think this upcoming week's matchup against Washington, giving up the second most points to opposing wide receivers. Yes, he's coming off a week in which he only put up 10 fantasy points, but look at what Washington's kind of given up to opposing wide receivers. Keenan Allen, 9 catches, 100 yards. Mike Williams, 8 catches, 82 and a touchdown. Shepard, for the New York Giants, went for 9 catches, 94. Slayton, 3 catches, 54 and a touchdown. Beasley this last week, 11 catches for 98. And Emmanuel Sanders went for 5 catches, 94 and 2 touchdowns. I mean, the amount of stats the wide receivers have put up against this defense. By all means, yes, you're starting Calvin Ridley. You already know that, and I don't have to convince you that. Just wanted to give you a little bit more perspective, a couple more stats as to why I believe in him. In terms of his entire offense, the target share he's seen, 25% target share is nothing of a joke. Like, that is incredible overall opportunity. I think that is going to continue to trend in the right direction and eventually going to lead to his overall success this season. Tyler Lockett is the final wide receiver I wanted to mention in terms of the wide receiver 1 category, specifically because Tyler Lockett may not, be at a full capacity this upcoming week against the 49ers. And I hope he is, and I hope he's healthy because, my goodness, the first 2 weeks of the season, Tyler Lockett was in that top 3 category, was the number 2 overall wide receiver, was dominating, week in and week out. And this is something that we've similarly seen him do in years past in which he has blow-up games. But unfortunately, the injury could end up being something that is going to slow him down or potentially make him miss this upcoming week. If that's the case, then of course, rankings are subject to change. We'll go ahead and we'll adjust it accordingly as we progress through the week. But as of this current moment in time, I think Tyler Lockett is a fantastic and overall play this upcoming week based on the overall matchup. I mean, the last time he played against the 49ers, he went for over 80 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns against the secondary. Again, we've talked about in relation to DK Metcalf. This secondary does not have a full capacity of health. Their pass rush wasn't even able to get after Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron Rodgers is working with backup offensive tackles. Again, as of this current moment in time, the Seahawks, they're 1-2. They need to get back on track, and if Tyler Lockett is ready to go, I absolutely expect him to be utilized heavily in this upcoming week's game. We move on to the wide receiver 2 category, beginning with Terry McLaurin. Now, I know Terry McLaurin had a little bit of an underwhelming week this last week, but then again, it was the Buffalo Bills and it was Tre'Davious White that was going to lock him down. And with that said, I think Terry McLaurin gets back on track this upcoming week, has a similar week to what we saw in week 2 against the New York Giants. Now, mainly because he plays against Atlanta, who have given up the 11th most points to opposing wide receivers. Just putting it in perspective, in terms of the top 2 wide receivers for the Philadelphia Eagles who played against Atlanta in week 1, 12 catches, 120 yards, 2 touchdowns. Tampa Bay wide receivers, when they played against Atlanta in week 2, Evans and Godwin, 9 catches, 137, and 3 receiving touchdowns. I mean, there's so much opportunity for potential success against the Atlanta Falcons secondary. Taylor Heineke has looked good. The offense is scoring. That is all we need to see. Obviously, the defense will have to adjust, but if we're going to get a shootout, it's even better for us, especially in regards to the potential upside of Terry McLaurin. I think he's a fantastic play in a good matchup. Don't forget, there's always going to be potential in which he doesn't get a touchdown. And if he doesn't, just like any other wide receiver, he's going to be volatile. But we have to look at the potential offensive pieces here. When Curtis Samuel comes back, of course, there will be more threats on the field to pull attention away from Terry McLaurin. As it currently stands, the backfield has not found much success. Logan Thomas has been decent, but Terry McLaurin is being hard focused by defenders and defensive coordinators. Eventually, I think it'll open up for him. He's going to find himself a lot of success. Chris Godwin's our number 14. Again, Chris Godwin is a fantastic wide receiver. In terms of consistency, he's been there every single week. 19 points in week 1, 14.2 in week 2, and this last week, 16.6 half PPR fantasy points, 6 catches, 74 yards. Got himself a rushing touchdown, luckily enough. But either way, I mean, in terms of total opportunity, just putting it in perspective, Tom Brady has thrown the ball more than any other quarterback in the National Football League, 141 times. Chris Godwin leads this team in total target share, 26 total targets. Mike Evans has 25 total targets, Gronk with 20. There is a lot of targets going around, but again, there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. If Chris Godwin comes off the week and he doesn't score a touchdown, especially against the Rams, he ends up becoming a 10-point wide receiver. And that's always going to be the potential struggle for this offense. And the fact that he is not able to see double-digit targets every single week because there are so many other guys involved, They play against New England this upcoming week. I don't think New England's defense is bad at all. Obviously, their secondary is where they pretty much pride themselves every single year. They've built themselves a great secondary overall. But in my opinion, Chris Godwin, based on the fact that he is the slot receiver of this offense and is going to continue to be, Tom Brady's right-hand man, Tom Brady's going out for revenge. And though Tom Brady's going to look for Gronk and AB, as both those guys have also played for the Patriots in the past, I still think that Godwin's going to find a lot of success in the given week and potentially put up, obviously what his baseline is. What is it? 14 points minimum with upside. That's what I expect here. CeeDee Lamb is our number 15 overall wide receiver. Man, he's been extremely underwhelming, hasn't he? I mean, the Dallas Cowboys offense, they haven't really needed to pass the ball in the last 2 games. They have effectively ran it with Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard. And to be honest, I don't blame them for not passing the ball. Yeah, they found 2 receiving touchdowns from Dalton Schultz this last week, and though that is unfortunate, it also has to do with the fact that they're running the ball so effectively that play action has opened itself up to the potential of a tight end leaking out and finding himself in the end zone. With that said, CeeDee Lamb playing against the Carolina Panthers secondary. We know J.C. Horn went down with an injury, with a fractured foot. He's out for the season. They tried to bring in Trey Herndon with a trade. That secondary is going to be a little bit underwhelming in comparison to weeks past, but I think that the Carolina Panthers as a whole, in terms of their defense, they're at the top of majority of the metrics in terms of points allowed, yardage allowed, overall, best defense. Yeah, they might be number 1, but it doesn't scare me because I don't really think the Carolina Panthers are as serious as they kind of present themselves based on their schedule. I think they're a paper team, and I think they're going to rip this upcoming week, mainly because CeeDee Lamb's going to be tearing them apart. I expect him to have himself a good week and get back on track, man. He got to get more targets. I mean, how many targets was it? 3 targets, 3 receptions, 66 yards. We need to see 8 targets minimum, like similar to week 2. Hopefully that's going to be the case. Adam Thielen is our number 16 overall. I mean, Adam Thielen has been unbelievable. Thus far this season, he has scored 4 touchdowns. Last year, 14, but we thought the regression was going to hit. And, to be honest, it hasn't. You want to know why? Because the Minnesota Vikings offensively picked up exactly where they left off last season, in which they were in a full stride in scoring a bunch of points against defenders. And luckily, they were able to pick up their first one of the season last week, and they're going to continue to, of course, try to light up defenses, specifically this upcoming week against the Cleveland Browns. Another one of these, playoff teams that is going to be a tougher matchup for them. But in my opinion, like I talked about in conjunction with, of course, Justin Jefferson and the potential success that he's going to have, I expect Adam Thielen to have himself a very successful week as well. Again, besides the number 1 wide receivers of respective offenses like Tyreek Hill going for 197 yards and a touchdown and Brandin Cooks 78 yards and a touchdown against the Cleveland Browns secondary, Adam Thielen always sneaks around and finds himself in very advantageous positions. He's, snuck around and found himself as the number 4 overall wide receiver as it currently stands in a half PPR scoring format. So either way, as long as Kirk Cousins has got his eyes looking in the direction of Adam Thielen, he's going to find success. DeAndre Hopkins is our number 17. I didn't know what exactly to do with DeAndre Hopkins, mainly because, is he injured? Is he dealing with a rib injury? Is it a rib cartilage injury? Is it something that is more pain tolerance, and can they go ahead and get him healthy for this upcoming week? And the fact that, again, like I've talked about, he has never missed a game in his career due to injury, and unfortunately was pretty much a distraction this last week. If in fact the practice week looks similar to last week, in which Wednesday, Thursday, Friday he is in limited capacity and or not even practicing at all, then maybe we go ahead and we undervalue him, because there's a lot of potential for these other receiving options. Christian Kirk, AJ Green, Rondell Moore, Chase Edmonds, Max Williams. There are a lot of other options in this offense that are going to be able to score and contribute in this respective week. So especially against, Jalen Ramsey, they might want to use DeAndre Hopkins as a distraction. My hope is that he's healthy, because if he is, my goodness, he has been a great receiving option, especially against Jalen Ramsey his entire career. If they want to put him on him, that's fine. When we go back to the days of Houston versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, or even the Cardinals of last year playing against the LA Rams, we have found a lot of success for DeAndre Hopkins. Averages over 10 fantasy points per game against Ramsey. I think there's a lot of potential this upcoming week. But again, the uncertainty kind of lowers him on my list for now. Deebo Samuel's our number 18. Again, Deebo Samuel's coming off a little bit of an underwhelming week, but 10 targets nonetheless for 5 receptions, 52 total yards. He had himself a couple, rushing attempts here and there, and it will get himself kind of integrated in the offense more and more as we progress. But in my opinion, when I think about Deebo Samuel and what he's capable of, if Ayuk kind of presents himself as more of a receiving threat and potential option going forward. It will, in my opinion, overall decrease the overall value of Deebo Samuel, because we're talking about a run-first offense that has a very highly targeted tight end. And of course, George Kittle is going to get his before anybody else. So if in fact Ayuk starts to dig into Deebo's work, we'll have some problems. But this upcoming week, I don't think we're going to see those problems. I think we're going to find Deebo Samuel finding himself, pretty much in the end zone, mainly because what we've seen from wide receivers against Seattle this season, that's pretty much been the case. I mean, just this last week, Justin Jefferson, 118 yards and a touchdown. Adam Thielen, 50 receiving yards and a touchdown. The week prior to that, Julio Jones went for 6 catches, 128 total yards, had himself a touchdown. But again, the camera and the line judge and the referees, they just didn't do their job. And then in week 1, Zach Pascal had himself 2 receiving touchdowns. There's a lot of potential for Deebo Samuel this upcoming week. I know in week 1 he had an explosive game. Maybe we should have sold high there. But for now, I think he could potentially get back to being, in that wide receiver 2 category and being a stable overall play. Amari Cooper is our number 19 this upcoming week. Amari Cooper, similar to CeeDee Lamb, has been very underwhelming. I mean, in week 1 of the 2021 fantasy football season, he finishes the number 1 overall wide receiver on the given week. Since then, in the last 2 weeks, he's been the number 83 overall wide receiver. Where has Amari Cooper gone? Of course, he's been dealing with injuries. Of course, this offense has run the ball heavily. But again, with J.C. Horn out, with them trying to bring in a new cornerback to teach him the defense, and an offense like the Dallas Cowboys that, in my opinion, is extremely potent and can pretty much score in any regard that they'd like at this current point, I think Amari Cooper is just in a matter of time until eventually he finally kind of gets back on track. When we looked at what Dak and Amari Cooper were able to do last season, it often had to do with game script. If they are in shootouts, they're going to throw the ball. They haven't found themselves in shootouts in the last 2 weeks. In fact, they found themselves very comfortably winning. And maybe, that game against the Chargers wasn't technically comfortable. Game-winning field goal. It was a lower scoring contest, and all they wanted to do was pound the rock and kill the clock. And as to this current moment in time, I think against the Carolina Panthers, it might very similarly be the case. And I'm hoping it won't be, but we're just going to have to play it out and see how Amari Cooper ends up producing. I play him at 19 because he has a lot of upside. And if in fact this is going to be a game in which they're throwing a lot, then he will, of course, be contributing heavily. We have Chase Claypool as our number 20. Chase Claypool's in a very interesting situation because similar to some of the other wide receivers we've talked about today, we don't know the current status of a Diontae Johnson and or a Juju Smith-Schuster. The offensive line for this team is beat up, but if in fact Chase Claypool is going to be the guy in this offense, then of course he should be highly targeted and of course automatically played this upcoming week. And that's why we put him at 20, coming off a week in which he had 15 targets, 9 catches, 96 yards, had himself almost a touchdown, but of course was double teamed for a majority of last week's game. Plays against the Green Bay Packers. I think Diontae Johnson is going to play. From what I read this morning, Coach Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers said that Diontae Johnson should be returning to practice on Wednesday. If that's the case, that opens up more potential for Chase Claypool. Of course, the targets are going to be in his direction because we're not going to see Najee Harris get 19 targets per week, guys. It's not going to be the case. So as of this current moment in time, I think there's a lot of potential for Chase Claypool this upcoming week in a matchup where they probably are throwing the entire time in order to keep up with Green Bay. In the last couple weeks, Green Bay, regardless of what wide receiver they've played against, they've given up at least one touchdown. Week 1, Harris, 72 yards and a touchdown. Cephas in week 2, 63 yards and a touchdown. And then, this last week, we had 37 receiving yards and a touchdown from Ayuk. There's always a potential of wide receivers scoring against this defense, and if anybody's going to do it, it'll be Claypool for the Steelers offense. Mike Evans is our number 21. Now, like I was mentioning with Godwin and him are pretty much hand in hand, the number 1 and 2 overall receiving threats on this offense. And I'm glad to see that in the last 2 weeks, Mike Evans has gotten 19 targets. Because considering what we saw in week 1, 6 total targets, 3 receptions, wasn't a great game, and a lot of us were scared, but comes off another great week, 8 catches, 106 receiving yards for 14.6 fantasy points, has a lot of red zone upside, especially against the defense like the New England Patriots, which again, they do have good cornerbacks, but when we're thinking about Tom Brady and probably trying to drop 7 touchdowns, maybe even trying to break the record this upcoming week, I really do think there is a potential possibility in which Mike Evans blows up this upcoming week, because when we get down into the red zone, if Gronk is going to be a little bit unhealthy this upcoming week, dealing with that rib injury, and of course, Chris Godwin's going to be heavily focused on in the slot, as of course, the New England Patriots slot corner is pretty good. I think Mike Evans on the outside, that's his go-to. That was his go-to at the beginning of last season, all the way till now, and hopefully we'll find success this upcoming week. I think Mike Evans, just of course, with the double-digit targets going in his direction and how much upside he has, he's just an automatic play every single week, especially when Tom Brady's going out for revenge and blood. Brandin Cooks is our number 22. So here is the issue that I have with Brandin Cooks. Mainly it has to do with his quarterback play. Tyrod Taylor going to Davis Mills is not advantageous for him. But with that even being said, he is still the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy. He's just been unstoppable. I mean, even with Davis Mills last week against the Carolina Panthers secondary that should be good, technically, based on the numbers and all that kind of mumbo jumbo. Brandin Cooks had himself 9 catches for 112 yards and 16.2 fantasy points. He's been targeted 32 times this season, which is the 4th most amongst all wide receivers this season. Now, the issue is he plays against the Buffalo Bills, and with a backup quarterback rookie at that, Davis Mills, playing against Buffalo, it is not going to be an easy task, especially when all Buffalo has to do is double team Brandin Cooks. Now, of course, Brandin Cooks is a very veteran wide receiver, and he's going to get himself open. He'll get himself his opportunities nonetheless. I mean, there's back-to-back games in which we've seen Davis Mills target Brandin Cooks 10 or more times. So we're going to get those automatic targets. It's a matter of what he ends up producing with them. Thus far this season, the Buffalo Bills have only given up a maximum of 62 yards to a single receiver, and that was last week, Terry McLaurin. Hopefully, Cooks can go above that number this week. OBJ is our number 23. I think Odell Beckham Jr. is poised for an incredible week, mainly because the Minnesota Vikings are awful in the secondary. They've given up the 4th most points to opposing wide receivers, and what we saw from OBJ this last week, 5 catches, 77 yards, 11.2 half PPR fantasy points in his 2021 debut, coming off the ACL injury that devastated his 2020 season. I think he's absolutely in a perfect spot to have an incredible week, mainly because Minnesota, let's talk about what they've given up. To Jamar Chase, 5 catches, 101 yards, and a touchdown. The Cardinals wide receivers, all 3 of them, Hopkins and Rondale Moore and AJ Green in that given week, scored a touchdown against them. And then DK Metcalf this last week, 6 catches, 107 and a touchdown. This Minnesota secondary can't stop a soul, and I think OBJ is primed and ready for a breakout performance. Moving on to Julio Jones as our number 24. He plays against the New York Jets, and I don't expect AJ Brown to play. He's dealing with a hamstring injury. That is going to hold him out. But unfortunately, Julio Jones is also questionable. And Julio Jones, at the end of last week's game, down in the red zone, in a game-winning drive, guess what? He's not on the field. He didn't play a lot last week, and I think he's dealing with an injury, and obviously the questionable tag, and of course the fact that he's popped up on the injury report speaks to that. So unfortunately, that is going to be the case, and we're going to have to monitor that going throughout this upcoming week. But the Jets matchup, I mean, this is going to be a blowout. But if it gets to the point where it's such a blowout that Julio Jones doesn't get utilization and is, pretty much limited all week long, then maybe we can go ahead and potentially sit him or leave him as a wide receiver 3 option. But for now, with the potential of what he has obviously been able to produce this season already going back to week 2, and what he is, he's a Hall of Fame wide receiver against a very lackluster secondary with the New York Jets. I think Julio Jones should be typically an automatic play. But we'll go ahead and, of course, keep an eye on what's going on with A.J. Brown and, of course, Julio as the week progresses. Moving on to our wide receiver 3 category, we talk about Marvin Jones Jr. I know Marvin Jones doesn't have a Jaguars jersey on, guys. I know. But sometimes when you try to go out and find an image that is perfect for them, the quality isn't up to the par. But let me tell you what is up to par. Marvin Jones has been unbelievable. We talked about it this offseason. Marvin Jones is a sleeper wide receiver that we want to go after, and there's a reason why they brought him over to this offense, because Darrell Bevell, the former offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions, is now the offensive coordinator of the Jaguars. And he was certainly going to bring over a piece that was going to be the security blanket for Trevor Lawrence. And that's exactly what it's been. There's a reason why Marvin Jones, as of thus far this season, has led the team in terms of total targets, has led the team in receiving yards, and is tied for the most touchdowns with 2. I think this upcoming week against Cincinnati Bengals Thursday night, giving up the 13th most points to opposing wide receivers, this is going to be a shootout. I mean, we're talking about games in which Claypool just this last week, 9 catches, 96 yards. We go back a couple weeks, Adam Thielen, 9 catches, 92 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Marvin Jones, maybe he can get himself 9, 90, and maybe 1. I'm hoping that's the case. We can move on to Tyler Boyd as our number 26. Now, speaking of this matchup, Tyler Boyd had himself a great last 2 weeks. I mean, in terms of target counts, scoring a touchdown this last week. We'd love to see that this upcoming week. T. Higgins has already been designated out, and that does give me even more confidence to start Tyler Boyd, because the last time I saw him on a Thursday Night Football game, my goodness, did he ball out. So, Going into this upcoming week's matchup, again, like I've mentioned it, the Jacksonville Jaguars and Cincinnati Bengals, both of their secondaries are amongst the worst in the National Football League. Specifically, the Jaguars giving up 112 receiving yards and 104 receiving yards to A.J. Green and to Christian Kirk this last week. Courtland Sutton went for 159. Brandin Cooks has put a number on them in week 1. I absolutely believe Tyler Boyd, a nice high-end wide receiver 3 option, especially in a full PPR, considering, of course, how many receptions he gets. But, of course, we'll always have the ability for that touchdown upside with Higgins out. Diontae Johnson is my number 27. I trust Diontae Johnson if he practices fully this upcoming week, mainly because, the first 2 weeks of the season, 10 targets, 12 targets, 12.1 fantasy points, 15 fantasy points and a half PPR. Regardless of the fact that they play against the Green Bay Packers, Big Ben loves to target Diontae Johnson. And when he's not on the field, Big Ben looks like a mess, and he's targeting his running backs 19 times. So again, I think Diontae Johnson, if in fact he is ready to play and he's healthy, regardless of this upcoming week's matchup, whether it is Jair Alexander, Kevin King, it doesn't matter to me. The rookie cornerback over there in Green Bay, whatever it ends up being, Diontae Johnson's going to get himself his over 10 targets. And if and when he does, of course, it's always going to lead to success. Like we've talked about it, when he gets his over 10 targets like he has in the last couple of seasons, the guy's nearly averaging 15 points per game in a half PPR. And imagine what that is in a full PPR, continuing to stride for greatness. Diontae Johnson's our number 27. We have 28, Corey Davis. I wouldn't say it's a revenge matchup, but that's kind of how I've sold it this week. Plays against his former team, the Tennessee Titans. Tennessee Titans are giving up the third most points to opposing wide receivers. Of course, week 1, DeAndre Hopkins, 83 receiving yards on 6 catches, 2 of those catches receiving touchdowns. Christian Kirk in that same game, 2 receiving touchdowns, 70 receiving yards. Tyler Lockett, 178 receiving yards and a touchdown. In the same game, Freddie Swain went for 95 and 1. I mean, Corey Davis, as of the last 3 weeks, 22 total targets. Not a bad number coming off of a week against, 2 back-to-back tough secondaries. I think this is a little bit of a break that Zach Wilson needs. And, of course, his number 1 receiving option has been Corey Davis, Braxton Berrios. I think Corey Davis finds himself in a far better situation in which the secondary and the, of course, pass rush isn't killing his quarterback before he can finish his route. We move on to Allen Robinson. Man, I wish Allen Robinson and, the Bears offense had a solidified quarterback because, Justin Fields was very, I don't even know how to express it. There's not an adjective that comes to mind that isn't a curse word as of right now in terms of describe how bad that offense looked. 6 completions in each of the last 2 weeks for Fields isn't going to cut it. I don't know what they're going to do with Dalton. I think he's still dealing with the bone bruise in his knee. And they're not going to play Foles because if they, in fact, they play him too much, they're going to owe him money in terms of incentives and snaps played. And I don't think they want to go ahead and shell for that. So it's just a matter of Allen Robinson playing against the Detroit Lions. Their secondary is not good. I don't care what happened with the Baltimore Ravens game. If we remember, if you went and watched that game, Sammy Watkins dropped a touchdown and Marquise Brown dropped 2 touchdowns. So in my opinion, there's a lot of room for potential upside here. It's just a matter of who's throwing him the ball. Last season when he played against Detroit, Allen Robinson had 2 games, 74 receiving yards in the first one and 75 in the second one. He's just got to get himself 7 catches there and maybe an upside of a touchdown. And we got ourselves back in the conversation. But until then, very sketchy play. Marquise Brown, speaking of a guy that wasn't able to produce against Detroit, my goodness, he dropped 2 free wide open touches. I mean, yes, he wasn't wide open, but it definitely wasn't a contested catch. I'll tell you that much. So as of this current moment in time, hopefully Marquise Brown doesn't get into his head, doesn't get the yips, doesn't end up dropping more passes and become the Diontae of this upcoming season. I understand there's a lot of potential for Marquise Brown considering his speed, the ability with one play, take the top off the defense. I think he's a great option this upcoming week in this upcoming matchup. The Denver defense in their secondary specifically, certainly one of the better ones, but Marquise Brown's getting enough targets to pretty much justify his play here at 30. We have Courtland Sutton. Speaking of the Denver matchup, Courtland Sutton is coming off a very inconsistent week. 5 catches, 37 yards on 5 targets, in comparison to the week prior in which he had 9 receptions for 159. So, what Courtland Sutton are we going to see this upcoming week? I think we see the better one. And though Marlon Humphreys will probably be covering him, it's a matter of game script. In the last couple weeks, they've handled their victories pretty easily because they just blow teams out. Jacksonville, New York, it didn't matter. They didn't have to heavily throw the ball. And with now, of course, Jerry Jeudy out since week 1, but now KJ Hamler unfortunately tearing his ACL, there's even more potential for targets. As of thus far, what we've seen from Teddy Bridgewater in terms of all quarterbacks in the National Football League, he is in the top 3 in terms of overall attempts of passes 20 or more yards. Courtland Sutton dominates in that category. I absolutely believe that he's going to be a solid play as a wide receiver 3 option. Robert Woods, no. You know what? His name is not Robert Woods. His name is Bobby Trees. We've talked about this. When Robert Woods does not show up, he is Bobby Trees, and that's what he's been all season long. And do I trust Bobby Trees? No. But I do trust the idea and the fact that Cooper Kupp is not going to be able to sustain a 35% target share and a 44% red zone target share for the rest of the season. He's not going to be able to do it. But if we go another week and we don't see Robert Woods return to the lineup and his 20.1 target share isn't enough to get himself over 10 fantasy points once again, then we're going to be in trouble. But I think eventually we're going to get back on track. It's a matter of when. And can you suffer enough to put him in your lineup and wait and hope that it's the week? Probably not. We'll probably get to a position where you're not going to start him this week. And because of that, he'll probably spite us all and have those good games. But I think it's only a matter of time. This offense is way too potent for them. And he's getting way too many targets for it not to eventually lead to his overall success. Jakobi Meyers is our number 33. It's the best matchup on the week. Tampa Bay, their secondary is not healthy. Carlton Davis, Jamel Dean, they are not ready, and they've given up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Jakobi Meyers is coming off of a game in which he had 9 catches, 14 targets, 94 receiving yards. In a full PPR, 18.4 fantasy points is pretty much a mini Sterling Shepard in the works and potentially getting there. So while Sterling Shepard is injured, for those of you who went and you already had him on your bench or went ahead and swooped him up, even though his rostered percentage was relatively high this week, I think it was near the 60% margin. Regardless, because of the matchup, of course, the opportunity he's seen recently, and the fact that James White is out, and you really aren't going to be able to run the ball against Tampa Bay, and Brady's going to be scoring a lot of points, and Mac Jones is probably going to have to throw for the entire game. All of this mentioned, Myers is in a pretty good spot this week. We have Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman Jr. in the last 2 weeks, he has seen 24 total targets, leading to 14 receptions. In one game, 68 yards. In the other, 123. No overall touchdowns, but in my opinion, when you play against the Miami Dolphins defense, there's always potential. Now, I know Xavier Howard, Byron Jones, these are good cornerbacks, but then again, they've given up, Nelson Aguilar, 72 yards and a touchdown, Diggs, 60 yards and a touchdown, Renfro, 77 yards and a touchdown. They've given up good performances, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that receivers like Michael Pittman Jr., regardless of the fact that his quarterback does not have any ankles, is going to be able to succeed. The opportunity is there, and as long as it's consistently there, I think Michael Pittman has a great chance of performing well this week. Antonio Brown's are 35. According to what I heard this morning, Bruce Arians has said that he is going to be off the protocol and off the IR on Thursday. That would get him on pace to play for Friday, which is fantastic. And if in fact he does, along with Gronkowski, he is another one of these players, and of course Tom Brady, not to mention it, that has played for this organization in the past, the New England Patriots. I think this is going to be one of those revenge games, and maybe all of these guys that have played for the New England Patriots in the past end up scoring. But again, we know that there's a lot of potential for one of these games to be a Gronk-focused game, a Godwin-focused game, an Evans-focused game. But like in week 1, going for 100 yards and a touchdown, it was an AB-focused game. May end up being the same thing this upcoming week. We'll just have to wait and see. Moving on to our final option, it's Tim Patrick. I wanted to go ahead and talk about him because in terms of consistency, he has been great. Over 10 points over the last 3 weeks. 39 in a touchdown, 37 in a touchdown, 5 catches for 98 yards this last week with Hamler and Judy out. I know Courtland Sutton is certainly an option in order to take overall value away from Tim Patrick, but it personally doesn't, pretty much scare me. And I think this offense with Bridgewater continuing to sling the rock is going to find a lot of success this upcoming week in a pretty good matchup. Overall, those are my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 4 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. If you like today's video, smash the like button down below. Comment down below who you think I am missing from the top 36 list. Is there guys that should be here that aren't being represented? Let me know down below who that ends up being, whether it is a Robbie Anderson, a Kenny Golladay, a Brandon Ayuk. There's a lot of guys out there that could be potentially on this list, and you got to let me know. DJ Chark, let me know down below. Outside of that, thank you everybody for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you have not yet already. Tomorrow we'll talk about quarterbacks and tight end rankings before the Thursday night football game. I appreciate you guys, and until next time, I'll see you. Peace.